The rescue bear ate on the porch for her favorite human every day. The morning mist clung to the treeline of the Great Smoky Mountains like the breath of sleeping giants, and Harry Whitman moved through it with the practiced silence of a man who had spent 73 years learning the mountain's moods. His weathered hands gripped the handle of a wicker basket, its bottom lined with an old dish towel that Martha had embroidered with tiny wildflowers back when her fingers were still nimble, and her laugh still echoed through the cabin's rooms. Harry paused at the edge of his small clearing where morning glories climbed the split-rail fence he'd built 40 years ago, with wood from trees that had watched over this hollow since before the Cherokee walked these paths. The cabin behind him stood solid and humble, its logs darkened by decades of mountain weather, smoke curling lazily from the stone chimney he'd mortared with his own hands. This had been their sanctuary, his and Martha's, a place where the noise of the world couldn't reach, and love could grow quiet and deep like old roots finding water. The path to the wild beehive wound through stands of tulip poplar and sugar maple, their leaves just beginning to show the first blush of autumn. Harry knew every stone, every root that might catch an unwary foot, every fallen log that served as a bridge across the small creek that sang its way down to the valley below. He'd been coming to this hive for 3 seasons now, ever since he discovered it in the hollow of a massive oak that lightning had split but not killed. The bees had been good to him, sharing their golden treasure in exchange for his respectful distance and gentle approach. But today, something was wrong. The forest held a different quality of silence, one that made the hair on the back of his neck prickle with an old instinct he'd nearly forgotten. No buzzing rose from the oak's hollow. No busy workers traced their aerial highways between flower and hive. As Harry approached the ancient tree, his steps slowed and then stopped altogether. She lay beneath the oak like a fallen monument to the wilderness, her massive form still and gray with the weight of too many winters. The old mother bear's fur had dulled from the rich brown Harry remembered glimpsing in previous years to the color of storm clouds, matted and lifeless. Her great head rested on outstretched paws. And even in death, there was something regal about her pose, as if she had chosen this spot beneath a lightning-scarred oak as a fitting place to take her final rest. But it was the movement beside her that stopped Harry's breath and started his heart hammering against his ribs. A tiny black bear cub, no bigger than a house cat, pressed its small face against its mother's dry teat, its pink tongue searching desperately for milk that would never come. When that failed, the cub placed its miniature paws against the massive shoulder and pushed with all the strength its small body could muster, making soft whimpering sounds that seemed to tear something loose in Harry's chest. "Lord have mercy," Harry whispered, his voice rough from years of speaking mainly to himself and the ghost of his memories. At the sound, the cub's head jerked up, and Harry found himself looking into dark eyes that held no fear, only a desperate intelligence that seemed far too old for such a small creature. Instead of fleeing, the cub took 3 unsteady steps toward him, its legs still uncertain beneath its compact body. It stopped just beyond arm's reach and tilted its head, those dark eyes boring into Harry's as if the cub could see straight through to his soul. The plea in that gaze was unmistakable: "Help me. Save me. Don't leave me here to die beside my mother." Harry had lived alone for the past 15 years, ever since the cancer had taken Martha piece by piece until there was nothing left but an empty bed and the echo of her voice in every corner of the cabin. He'd chosen solitude like a monk chooses poverty, embracing the silence as both penance and protection. The last thing he needed was responsibility for another living creature, especially one that would grow into several hundred pounds of muscle and claw. But as the cub took another halting step forward, something in Harry's carefully constructed armor cracked. Maybe it was the way the morning light caught the silver threads in the cub's black fur, or the soft sound it made that was part whimper, part question. Maybe it was simply that he recognized the look in those dark eyes because he'd seen it in his own mirror every morning for 15 years, the bewildered loneliness of a soul left behind. "Well, hell," Harry murmured, setting down his honey basket and shrugging out of his old flannel coat. "Come here then, little fellow." The cub didn't hesitate. It stumbled forward on unsteady legs and allowed Harry to wrap it in the warm flannel, its small body fitting easily in the crook of his arm. Up close, Harry could feel how thin it was beneath its fluffy baby fur. He could hear the faint whistle of its breathing that spoke of hunger and exhaustion. "Scout," Harry said suddenly, the name appearing in his mind like a gift. "That's what we'll call you, Scout, because you're going to have to learn to navigate this old world. And I suppose I'm going to have to learn right alongside you." The walk back to the cabin passed in a blur of practical concerns. What did bear cubs eat? How often did he even have anything suitable in his sparse pantry? Harry's bachelor existence had grown increasingly simple over the years: coffee, beans, cornbread, the occasional rabbit or trout, and the vegetables from his small garden. Nothing that would sustain a growing cub. Inside the cabin, Harry settled Scout on an old quilt near the wood stove and began rummaging through his limited supplies. The cub watched his every movement with those unervingly intelligent eyes, occasionally making soft sounds that might have been questions or simply comments on his new surroundings. "Well, Scout," Harry said, holding up a can of condensed milk and a jar of corn syrup. "I'm about to prove that necessity really is the mother of invention." He mixed the condensed milk with warm water until it was thin and sweet, then improvised a feeding device with an old medicine bottle and a finger from a rubber glove, cutting a small hole in the tip. It was crude, but when he offered it to Scout, the cub latched on with desperate hunger, its small paws gripping the bottle while it nursed. That first night, Scout whimpered softly in his sleep, clearly searching for his mother's warmth and scent. Harry found himself sitting on the floor beside the wood stove, one hand resting lightly on the cub's small back, feeling the flutter of its breathing and the occasional twitch of its legs as it dreamed. When the whimpering grew more distressed, Harry began to sing old songs that Martha used to hum while she worked in her garden, melodies that had lived in the walls of the cabin for so long they seemed part of its foundation. "Hush now, Scout." Harry's voice was rusty from disuse, but the cub seemed to find comfort in the low rumble of it. "Tomorrow we'll figure this out together." As days turned into weeks, Scout grew with the startling rapidity of all young things. His legs grew sturdier, his appetite increased, and his personality began to emerge like a photograph developing in chemical baths. He was curious about everything, investigating Harry's boots with his nose, batting at dust motes that danced in the afternoon sunlight, and developing an odd fascination with the sound of Harry's old radio when he turned it on for the evening news. But it was Scout's eagerness to help that surprised Harry most. The cub seemed to understand that this strange, gray-haired giant was his provider and protector, and he set about making himself useful in the most endearing ways. Each morning, Scout would present Harry with small offerings: a glove that had fallen from the porch rail, his handkerchief retrieved from wherever he'd left it the night before, or simply a pine cone that had caught his fancy during their walks. One crisp October morning, Harry was carrying an armload of split wood from the pile behind the cabin when his foot caught on an uneven porch board. He went down hard, the wood scattering around him and his knee screaming in protest. As he lay there, catching his breath and mentally cataloging what might be bruised or broken. He became aware of a sound he'd never heard before. Scout was making a noise that could only be described as laughter, a soft chuffing sound that came from deep in his chest. His small black lips pulled back in what looked remarkably like a grin. The cub was standing over Harry, head tilted to one side, and the expression on his face was so comically concerned yet amused that Harry couldn't help but laugh in return. "Think that's funny, do you?" Harry asked, pushing himself up to sitting. "Wait until you're old enough to trip over your own paws." But as he laughed, Harry felt something shift inside his chest, like ice breaking up on a pond in spring. It had been years since he'd laughed with genuine joy. Years since he'd felt the simple pleasure of sharing a moment of absurd humor with another living being. Scout seemed to sense the importance of the moment, too, because he padded over and settled himself against Harry's side, his warm weight a comfort against the autumn chill. The full moon nights became special times for them both. Harry would sit on the porch in his old rocking chair, reading aloud from the books of poetry that Martha had loved, Robert Frost, Maya Angelou, Mary Oliver, while Scout stretched out on the wooden planks beside him. The cub would rest his chin on his paws and watch Harry's face as he read, his dark eyes reflecting the silver moonlight, his breathing slow and peaceful. "The woods are lovely, dark and deep," Harry would read, his voice carrying across the clearing to the edge of the forest where night sounds whispered their ancient secrets. "But I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep." Scout would make soft rumbling sounds deep in his chest, a kind of bearish purr that seemed to indicate contentment and understanding. Harry began to fancy that the cub really did comprehend something about the rhythm and music of the words, if not their meaning. There was something almost mystical about those moonlit reading sessions, as if they were participating in an ancient ritual of storytelling that connected them to all the lonely souls who had ever found comfort in words and companionship. November brought the first serious cold, and with it Harry's annual battle with bronchitis. This year, it seemed worse, settling deep in his chest and refusing to be dislodged by the usual remedies of honey and whiskey. For 3 days, he could barely get out of bed, his body racked with coughing fits that left him weak and gasping. Scout seemed to understand that something was wrong. He abandoned his usual playful explorations and took up a vigil beside Harry's bed, his warm bulk pressed against the old man's side. When the coughing fits were at their worst, Scout would place one large paw on Harry's hand, the weight of it somehow comforting and grounding. His dark eyes never left Harry's face, and there was something almost human in the concern they reflected during the long hours of fever and fitful sleep. Harry found himself talking to Scout about Martha. He told him about the day they'd met at a church social in Gatlinburg, how she'd been wearing a yellow dress that made her look like captured sunshine. He described their wedding day when she'd insisted on picking wildflowers for her bouquet because she said store-bought flowers had no soul. He talked about the garden she'd planted, how her hands could coax life from the most stubborn soil, and how she'd sing to her plants because she believed they grew better with music. "She would have loved you, Scout," Harry whispered one night when the fever made him feel disconnected from everything except the warm weight of the bear beside him. "She always said the best companions were the ones who loved without judgment and asked for nothing but kindness in return." When Harry wept, and he did weep, for Martha, for the years that had passed like water through his fingers, for the loneliness that had been his only companion for so long, Scout would gently lick the tears from his cheeks. Then the bear would lumber to the old chest at the foot of the bed and return with Martha's handkerchief, the one she'd carried on their wedding day, its lace edges yellow with age. He would place it carefully on Harry's chest as if he understood that some sorrows required talismans of love to heal. As Harry recovered from his illness, he made a decision that surprised even him. He took Scout to the overgrown patch of ground in front of the porch where Martha had once cultivated her flower garden. The plot was choked with weeds now, the neat rows and careful borders long since surrendered to the wild. "This is where she grew her daisies," Harry told Scout, kneeling in the cold dirt and pulling up handfuls of dead grass. "Every spring, this whole area would be white and yellow with them. She said they were the happiest flowers, always facing the sun, always smiling." Harry pulled out a small envelope from his jacket pocket, its paper soft with handling. Inside were the seeds he'd saved from Martha's last daisies, collected the autumn before she died, and kept in the cool darkness of his pantry like a promise he wasn't sure he'd ever have the courage to keep. "I want you to learn their scent," Harry said, opening the envelope and letting Scout sniff the tiny seeds, "so that when they bloom again, you'll know what she loved." He planted the seeds carefully, his arthritic fingers gentle with each tiny promise of spring. Scout watched the process with intense concentration, occasionally sniffing at the disturbed earth or nudging Harry's hand with his nose in what seemed like encouragement. That winter was long and harsh, with snow that piled up past the porch rails and wind that howled through the mountains like the voices of ancient spirits. But Harry was no longer alone with his ghosts. Scout had grown large enough to be a real companion, his shoulders broad and his strength impressive. Yet he remained gentle whenever he was near Harry. The bear had learned to modulate his power with almost human sensitivity. When they played together, and they did play, like an old man and his beloved dog, Scout would use only the tips of his claws, batting at Harry's hands with just enough force to be fun without being dangerous. When Harry's arthritis made walking difficult, Scout would pace slowly beside him, his solid bulk serving as a living cane when the old man needed to lean on something. In the mornings, Scout had taken over the ritual of bringing Harry his coffee. Harry had rigged up a timer for his old percolator, and Scout had learned to carefully carry the metal cup out to the porch, walking with the precise concentration of a child carrying a full glass of milk. He would set it down on the small table beside Harry's rocking chair and then settle himself nearby, watching with evident satisfaction as Harry took his first sip. But perhaps the most magical moments came when Harry played the piano. The old upright had been Martha's, and for years after her death, Harry couldn't bear to touch the keys. But Scout's presence had awakened something in him, a desire to fill the cabin with music again. The bear would sit on the piano bench beside Harry, his weight making the old wood creak. And when Harry played the melodies that Martha had loved, Scout would thump his paw against the bench in a rhythm that resembled applause. His eyes would half close in contentment, and the deep rumbling purr that emerged from his chest provided a bass note to whatever Harry was playing. The years flowed past like the creek that ran beside Harry's cabin, sometimes rushing with the urgency of spring melt, sometimes moving slow and gentle as a summer afternoon. Scout grew from a playful cub into a magnificent adult bear, his coat thick and lustrous, his movements powerful yet still gentle when he was with Harry. Their bond had deepened beyond companionship into something that transcended species, a connection of souls who had found in each other what they hadn't even known they were searching for. Harry was 80 now, his hair gone completely white, his body bent with the accumulated weight of decades spent in the mountain's embrace. His hands shook more often than they were steady, and his breathing came harder on the steep paths he'd once climbed with easy confidence. But his mind remained sharp, and his love for Scout had only grown stronger with time. The bear had become Harry's caretaker in ways both practical and profound. On cold mornings, when Harry's joints protested movement, Scout would lie across his legs like a living blanket, his body heat chasing away the ache that seemed to settle deeper each winter. When Harry worked in his garden, Scout would follow behind him, gently nudging him toward the shade when the sun grew too hot, or fetching his hat when he forgot it on the porch rail. Scout had learned the rhythms of Harry's days better than any human caretaker could have. He knew when Harry needed his afternoon rest and would lead him to his favorite chair by the window. He understood which days were difficult ones, when the weight of memory pressed down like storm clouds. And on those days, he would stay especially close, his large head resting on Harry's knee while the old man's fingers moved through his thick fur. The garden had flourished under their shared attention. Martha's daisies had returned with a vengeance, spreading beyond their original borders to create a sea of white and yellow that bloomed from early spring through the first frost. Scout had indeed learned their scent, and each morning during daisy season, he would lead Harry to the patch and stand among the flowers, his black fur stark against the pale petals, breathing deeply as if he could inhale the essence of the woman who had planted the first seeds. Harry had told Scout so many stories about Martha over the years that sometimes he felt as if the bear had known her himself. He would describe how she looked in the morning light, her hair catching fire from the sun streaming through the kitchen window. He told Scout about her laugh, how it started as a giggle and built into something that could fill a room with joy. He shared memories of her garden wisdom, her terrible cooking, her gift for finding four-leaf clovers, and her habit of talking to the wildlife as if they were old friends. "She would have adopted half the forest if I'd let her," Harry told Scout one afternoon as they sat among the daisies, "every injured bird, every orphaned creature. She had a heart big enough for the whole world." Scout would listen to these stories with the patience of a confessor, his dark eyes fixed on Harry's face, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed to encourage him to continue. Sometimes Harry wondered if the bear understood more than seemed possible, if there was some kind of magic in their connection that allowed Scout to see Martha through Harry's words and memories. The changing seasons marked the passage of time in ways that had become both comforting and poignant. Spring brought the return of the daisies and the ritual of cleaning up winter's patronage. Summer meant long afternoons on the porch, Harry reading while Scout dozed in the shade of the old oak. Autumn was harvest time when they would gather the last vegetables from the garden and prepare for another winter together. But it was winter that had become their most intimate season. When snow blocked the mountain roads and the world outside their clearing disappeared behind a curtain of white, Harry and Scout would settle into a rhythm of quiet companionship that felt as natural as breathing. Scout would keep the fire fed with logs he carried in his massive jaws, his movements careful and precise around the old wood stove. In the evenings, they would sit together in the warm glow of firelight, Harry's arthritis eased by Scout's body heat. The bear's steady breathing a lullaby that carried Harry into peaceful sleep. On Harry's 82nd birthday, Scout disappeared into the forest just after dawn, leaving Harry to wonder if something had finally awakened the wild instincts that civilization had kept dormant. The old man spent the day trying to occupy himself with small tasks, but his eyes kept drifting to the tree-line, searching for a familiar black shape among the shadows. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Scout emerged from the woods carrying something in his mouth. He approached the porch with the careful gait he used when he was carrying something precious. And when he reached Harry's chair, he gently deposited his gift at the old man's feet, wild daisies, a dozen of them. Their petals slightly crushed, but their centers still bright as tiny suns. Scout must have found them growing in some protected hollow where spring arrived early, Some secret place where Martha's influence still lingered like a blessing. Harry's eyes filled with tears as he gathered the flowers, their familiar scent carrying him back across decades to another time, another life. "Thank you, Scout," he whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "She would have loved knowing you remembered." Scout settled himself at Harry's feet, his large head resting on his paws, and for a long moment they sat in perfect silence as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared over the ridge. It was, Harry thought, the most perfect birthday gift he could have imagined. As Harry's 85th year approached, the weight of time began to press down on both of them with increasing force. Harry's cough had returned that winter, deeper and more persistent than ever before. His appetite dwindled, and some mornings he struggled to summon the energy to leave his bed. Scout seemed to sense that their time together was growing short, and his vigilance intensified accordingly. The bear rarely left Harry's side now, positioning himself where he could watch the old man's every breath, every movement. When Harry dozed in his chair, Scout would lie pressed against his legs, his own breathing synchronized with Harry's, as if he could somehow lend his strength to keep the old man anchored to life. When Harry woke in the night, gasping from dreams that seemed more real than waking, Scout's warm presence would calm his racing heart and ease him back into peaceful sleep. Spring came late that year, and when the daisies finally bloomed, they seemed more vibrant than ever, as if they were offering their beauty as a final gift. Harry spent many afternoons sitting among them, Scout beside him, both of them soaking up the warmth of the mountain sun, in the sweet fragrance of the flowers that connected them to Martha's enduring love. On a clear morning in early October, when the mountains were dressed in their autumn glory, and the air carried the first sharp promise of winter, Harry woke with the certain knowledge that this would be his last day in the cabin that had sheltered his love, his grief, and his unexpected joy. He felt it in the weight of his bones, in the way his breath came short and shallow, in the deep tiredness that no amount of rest could cure. Scout knew it, too. The bear's dark eyes held a sadness that seemed too deep for any creature to bear, but also a kind of peaceful acceptance that spoke of wisdom beyond words. They spent the morning together in the garden, Harry's hand resting on Scout's broad back as they moved slowly among the flowers. The daisies seemed to glow in the autumn light, their white petals luminous against the darker colors of the season. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Harry made his way to his favorite chair on the porch, the same rocker where he'd spent countless evenings reading to Scout, where they'd watched storms roll across the mountains and marveled at sunsets that painted the sky in impossible colors. Scout settled himself at Harry's feet, his large body warm and solid against the old man's legs. "I need to tell you something, Scout," Harry said, his voice soft as the whisper of wind through autumn leaves. "I need you to know that these years with you have been the greatest gift of my life. When I found you by your mother's side, I thought I was saving you. But the truth is, you saved me." Scout's ears pricked forward as if he understood the importance of what Harry was saying. The bear's dark eyes were fixed on Harry's face with an intensity that seemed to memorize every line, every shadow. "You taught me that love doesn't end when we lose someone," Harry continued, his hand moving gently through Scout's thick fur. "It just finds new ways to show itself. You brought Martha back to me in ways I never expected. In your gentleness, in your loyalty, in the way you learned to love her flowers and carry her memory in your heart." The sun was setting now, the sky painted in shades of purple and gold that reflected off the windows of the cabin and turned the clearing into something magical. Harry felt a deep peace settling over him, the same feeling he'd experienced on his wedding day when Martha had taken his hand and promised to love him for all the days of their lives. I don't know what happens next, Harry whispered, but I know that love this deep doesn't just disappear. Somehow, somewhere, Martha and I will be together again. And somehow, you'll always be part of that love. Scout made a soft sound deep in his chest, a rumble that seemed to hold all the words he couldn't speak. He shifted closer to Harry, his great head resting on the old man's knee, his weight warm and comforting. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Harry stroked Scout's head one last time. "Thank you for teaching me how to love again," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the evening sounds of the mountain. Scout's response was a gentle rumble that seemed to say, "And thank you for showing me what family means." Harry closed his eyes, and for a moment he could smell Martha's perfume on the evening breeze. He could hear her laughter mixing with the sound of Scout's breathing. Peace flowed through him like warm honey, carrying away the pain and loneliness of all the years since Martha's death. Scout remained where he was through the night, keeping his vigil as he had for so many years. When the sun rose over the Great Smoky Mountains, painting the cabin in the clearing with gentle morning light, it found two souls who had found each other in the wilderness and loved without reservation, without fear, without the need for words to express what their hearts had always known. In the days that followed, when the Forest Service workers came and found them, they marveled at the sight of the great black bear who refused to leave the old man's side, who seemed to be standing guard over something precious beyond their understanding. They spoke in hushed tones about the daisies that grew wild around the cabin, about the sense of peace that seemed to permeate the clearing, about the way the bear looked at them with eyes that held more wisdom than they had ever seen in any wild creature. Eventually, Scout did return to the forest, but he never went far from the cabin. Park rangers would sometimes spot him in the distance, a magnificent black shape moving through the trees with purpose and grace. And every spring, when the wild daisies bloomed around the old cabin, visitors would swear they saw him there among the flowers, standing guard over the memory of a love that had transcended species, time, and even death itself. The cabin still stands in its clearing in the Great Smoky Mountains, weathered but solid, its windows reflecting the changing light of the seasons. The daisies continue to bloom each spring, spreading wider each year as if Martha's love is still growing, still finding new ground to bless. And sometimes on quiet evenings when the mist rises from the valleys and the mountains hold their breath, those who know how to listen can hear the echo of an old man's voice reading poetry to the darkness and the gentle rumble of a bear's contentment in response. It is a sound that speaks of love found in the most unexpected places, of families that form beyond the boundaries of blood and species, of the courage to open one's heart even when it has been broken. It is the song of Scout and Harry still being sung in the wind that moves through the mountains, still being written in the white petals of daisies that bloom each spring like promises of love that never truly ends.